If you spent too much time on the internet, like me, you may have seen the term Friendslop tossed around, referring to the recent wave of Lethal Company-esque games coming out in the last couple of years. Games like Repo, Content Warning, The Headliners, etc. The most recent game to have come out, only a couple months ago, time of recording, is what I'd consider the peak of this genre, which is fitting because the game is literally called Peak. Note, I say genre with invisible air quotes because I wouldn't really consider Friendslop a genre of game, but there's not really a better term to describe these games, so unfortunately Friendslop will have to do. But anyways, here's my take. Peak is one of the best, if not the best, game in the indie co-op game market at this time, for a couple of big reasons. But before we get into those reasons, quick history refresher. Lethal Company came out near the end of 2023, which caught me off guard when I went to go check. Time flies when you're being unproductive, I guess. And seemingly instantly, it became a huge success, likely thanks to live streamers and YouTubers picking it up and making all these hilarious moments happen with their friends. Moments that also may have happened with you and your friend group, because what made Lethal Company so successful wasn't necessarily gameplay, but more so the reactions to the things that happened, and the game was a catalyst to this shared enjoyment of hanging out with friends and being silly. Lethal Company wasn't the first of its kind, see games like Phasmophobia, for example, but it was genre-defining in that it inspired many other games, mainly due to factors like a relatively simple gameplay loop, go down to a planet, grab as much loot as you can, buy items, rinse, repeat, and a low price point at just $10, making for great ease of entry for many. In the years that followed, quite a few games similar to Lethal Company came out, trying to replicate its success. I mentioned some examples already, but in case any of you Zoomers out there watching forgot, here they are again. Repo, Content Warning, The Headliners, these being the most prominent examples. Now, I have nothing against these games, they can be fun as well, but they don't quite execute their concepts as well as Lethal Company did, or like Peak does now. Of the two main factors I mentioned for Lethal Company's success, pretty much all the others also execute on. Price. All those games I mentioned hover around the $10 price point, which is great to see in contrast to what AAA developers are doing these days. I mean, come on, $80 for Mario Kart World? Let's get real, man. Anyways, what Lethal Company and Peak do better than their peers is the ease of access from a gameplay standpoint. And yes, I know I'm basically just saying these games are good because the gameplay is good, which is obvious, but there's a few different factors that go into that statement, some of which I'd argue that Peak does even better than Lethal Company. For example, Peak does a great job overall of having easy to understand mechanics and a clear direction for progression, which, to be fair, is pretty easy to do when the goal is climb that massive mountain over there. From here, Peak and Lethal Company actually have some similarities in other mechanics, such as having items and objects in the world that you have to figure out their level of usefulness, such as the different types of food you can forage in Peak, and the different enemies and traps you encounter in Lethal Company. These things are figured out either through trial and error, or as I like to describe it, tribal knowledge, meaning knowledge passed down to you from your tribal elders, aka your friend who watches too many Twitch streams and already knows how every item and enemy in the game works, who then serves as your virtual Sherpa, saving you from getting poisoned by those green crisp berries that look just as edible as the red ones. Anyways, once you've figured out all these different items and objects, that's where I think Peak would get another point over Lethal Company, the replayability long term. For Lethal Company, once you've figured out all the items and enemies, the gameplay loop gets a little bit less enticing in my opinion, as it kind of just turns into running into these randomly generated dungeons that can become a little samey looks-wise, and then just wander around looking for randomly generated loot while avoiding the various monsters/traps. This isn't meant to knock on Lethal Company. I do think this can still be fun. It can just get a little stale fairly quickly if you play a lot, especially if you play a lot in a short amount of time. Peak, on the other hand, while similar in that it can get stale if played too much, is built specifically, intentionally or not, to not be played too much too quickly. In Peak, the mountain changes every day, so if you get stuck in a particular climb, you can just come back another day to hopefully get something easier. On the other hand, if you do beat the day's mountain, you can also come back another day for a fresh new challenge. There are also some modifiers, ascents, which you unlock by peaking the summit on the previous ascent difficulty, which also adds a layer of challenge to each climb. Mainly though, the daily island reset makes it super easy to pick up Peak every once in a while, as you know that going in, it's going to be a new island / mountain that you haven't climbed before. Another big thing that Peak does to stand out is the overall theme of the game, or in other words, not horror themed. Those other Lethal Company-esque games I mentioned all fell into the trap of using horror and jump scares to try to replicate the moments generated by Lethal Company players. And although those games all have fairly unique settings, they all fell into the overarching horror genre, which I think got a bit boring to most people over time. Peak, however, is pretty much the exact opposite of horror, at least vibes-wise. When you think about it, the setting it can be a bit scary if it happened in real life. Your plane crashes like 80% of the way to your destination, and the only way you can survive is by climbing this massive mountain, which you are not at all prepared to climb, besides presumably having some basic camping and climbing knowledge from being a nature scout, as the game's description calls you. Even worse, the only other people who survived the crash were other scouts, and speaking as a former Boy Scout, that is either going to be a really fun or a really bad time, depending on who got lucky enough to survive the crash. This is all hypothetical, of course. You do obviously get to choose who you play with, but, knowing my luck, if the setting of Peak happened to me in real life, I'd probably end up stuck with the most annoying scouts of all time. To go on a slight tangent, I recently came across a video by Rasputin that talked about the idea of a language of gaming and this inherent tribal knowledge ingrained into video games, such as similar control schemes between games, like space or X or A or whatever to jump, WASD or left stick to move, etc., knowing when to interact with glowing objects, stuff like that. I want to touch on that subject myself at some point, and how games do a good or bad job of being accessible to non-gamers, but specifically in the case of Peak, they do a pretty good job of being accessible overall, in a thematic way. When you spawn in on the beach, there's a guidebook on the ground that you can pick up and read, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know to get your climb started. Additionally, there are on-screen prompts for pretty much every interaction in the game, which is super handy. The one thing I'd add, on the off chance that the developers see this, is some sort of climbing tutorial similar to the guidebook, but in the airport lobby area. Maybe a sign next to the rock climbing wall that shows you the climbing controls. That way players can get accustomed to the controls in the lobby, which I figure is the point of having that climbing wall there to begin with. To reiterate, I don't have anything against any of those other games in the Friendslop genre, well, most of them at least. I just don't think most games execute well enough on what made Lethal Company a hit, and what makes Peak even better. Peak is one of the best examples of what this type of game can and should be. And if you don't believe me, try Peak out for yourself. As this video is coming out, they should be releasing a new update, which is adding a new mesa biome and new items to the game. On an unrelated note, an upcoming game I'd keep an eye on is Big Walk. I'm not sponsored or anything, but it does look very promising to be as good as Peak, if not maybe better. There's not much to see on Big Walk's store page yet, but here's the description. Hang out and get lost with close friends in a big world. A cooperative online walker-talker from the... walker-talker? That's a way better descriptor than Friendslop. Why am I not seeing this until now, all the way at the end of the video?